Ethan Walker stood in the command room of the Resolute, his eyes fixed on the flickering holographic display that stretched across the room. The Imperial fleet had arrived. Their sleek, silver ships, polished to a blinding sheen, drifted effortlessly at the edge of the solar system, casting an eerie glow against the backdrop of space. His crew worked silently around him, the tension palpable in the air. "Just like clockwork," Ethan murmured under his breath, his fingers brushing against the edge of the command console. They had expected this. Months of reconnaissance, coded transmissions, and rumors all led to this moment. The Empire's arrogance had been their only constant, and now, they had come to assert their dominance over Earth. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, his second-in-command, leaned in beside him. Her voice was tight, controlled. "Scans show they've deployed their vanguard. Nothing too advanced yet, but it won't be long before they bring in the real firepower." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let them think we're not ready." Behind them, the rest of the bridge crew exchanged nervous glances. Earth had always been seen as a backwater planet, its technology outdated, its fleet obsolete. The Galactic Empire had ruled for centuries, crushing any who dared to oppose them. But this time, things were different. Earth had been preparing, quietly, steadily, and without the Empire's notice. Ethan stepped forward, the glow of the hologram casting sharp shadows on his face. "Activate the cloaking field. Let them come a little closer." Lieutenant Hayes hesitated for a moment, then nodded to the crew. "Cloaking field active." A soft hum filled the room as the Resolute shimmered briefly, vanishing from sight. On the Imperial screens, it would appear as though the ship had simply disappeared, leaving only the vast emptiness of space in its place. "They won't expect us to hide," Ethan said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "The Empire has never been subtle. They'll send a few scouts in to investigate, and when they do, they'll see us as an easy target." Hayes finished. She glanced over at him. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" Ethan turned, his eyes locking onto hers. "We have no choice. This is the only way." A beat of silence hung between them before she nodded, her gaze hardening with resolve. "Understood, sir." The minutes dragged on, each second ticking by like an eternity. Outside, the Imperial vanguard advanced cautiously, their ships casting long shadows across the void. They were fast, sleek, each one bristling with weaponry that could tear through a dozen planets. To the untrained eye, Earth's Resolute seemed woefully outmatched. But they didn't know the ship's true capabilities. Ethan watched as one of the Imperial scouts broke formation, drifting closer to their position. "Wait for it." His voice was barely above a whisper. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every crew member's eyes were glued to their stations, hands hovering over controls, waiting for the order. Closer. Closer. The scout ship's engines hummed steadily as it approached the invisible outline of the Resolute. "No," Ethan ordered. In an instant, the Resolute decloaked, its form materializing like a predator out of the darkness. Before the Imperial scout could react, the Resolute's weapons systems locked on, and with a single, precise blast, the ship exploded into a ball of fire and debris. The bridge erupted in a flurry of motion. Lieutenant Hayes barked commands, her voice sharp and clear, as the crew scrambled to recalibrate the targeting systems. The Empire would have noticed by now. There was no turning back. Ethan stood unmoving, his mind racing ahead. The scout was nothing. A warning shot. The real test was still to come. "They're scrambling, Captain," one of the officers reported. "The rest of the fleet is on high alert." "Good," Ethan replied. "Let them come. We're just getting started." From the edge of the fleet, another set of ships broke formation, larger this time, bristling with advanced weaponry. The Empire was done playing games. "They're sending in their cruisers," Lieutenant Hayes said, her voice tight with anticipation. "Shields are up. Weapons ready." Ethan's eyes narrowed as the Imperial ships closed in. The tension on the bridge was electric. His fingers drummed lightly on the console as he calculated their next move. "Weapons stand by," he ordered. The command was calm, almost detached. Around him, the crew held their breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. The Imperial cruisers opened fire first, bright streaks of energy lancing through space. The Resolute swerved effortlessly, its thrusters firing in rapid bursts to avoid the barrage. But it was all a distraction. The Empire still didn't understand what they were dealing with. "Engage the pulse cannon," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. Lieutenant Hayes hesitated. "Sir, I know what it is." "Do it." Without another word, the crew complied. Deep within the Resolute, the pulse cannon began to charge, its core glowing with a bright, menacing light. The hum of power reverberated through the ship as the weapon prepared to fire. Outside, the Imperial cruisers continued their assault, unaware of the trap they had walked into. "On my mark," Ethan said, his gaze never leaving the holographic display. The Empire had come to crush Earth's resistance, confident in their superiority. But they had no idea how far humanity had come, or how much they had to lose. The pulse cannon reached full charge, its glow now visible on the exterior of the ship. Ethan's hand hovered over the firing control, his heart pounding in his chest. "Fire!" A blinding flash erupted from the Resolute, a surge of energy unlike anything the Imperial ships had ever encountered. The cruisers, once mighty and imposing, flickered as their shields crumbled under the force of the blast. Systems failed, weapons powered down, and in an instant, the Empire's pride was shattered. Ethan watched as the enemy ships drifted helplessly, their systems offline. The Resolute stood victorious, but he knew this was only the beginning. "Captain," Lieutenant Hayes breathed, her voice filled with awe and fear. "What now?" Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the shattered remains of the Imperial fleet. "Now," he said quietly, "we wait." But even as the words left his mouth, a warning light began to blink on the console, a signal from deep within the ship. Something was wrong. The pulse cannon had fired, but not without consequence. "Sir?" an officer called out, his voice strained with panic. "We've got a malfunction. It's—" Before he could finish, the ship lurched violently, and alarms blared across the bridge. Ethan's heart sank. The real battle had just begun. Alarms blared across the bridge as the Resolute lurched violently, sending several crew members stumbling against their consoles. The pulse cannon's blast had been overwhelming, but the fallout was worse than anyone had expected. "Status report!" Ethan barked, gripping the edge of his console to steady himself. Lieutenant Hayes scrambled to her station, her fingers flying across the interface. "The pulse overloaded several key systems, Captain. Engines are failing, and the core is unstable." Ethan cursed under his breath. They had accounted for the pulse cannon's immense energy output, but not for the unknown variables, especially the alien technology they had reverse-engineered to create it. He had hoped the risks would be manageable, but now, their greatest weapon was turning into their biggest liability. Dr. Niles, the ship's chief engineer, appeared at the back of the bridge, his face grim. "It's worse than we thought," he muttered as he strode toward Ethan. "The energy output from the cannon wasn't properly contained. The feedback has destabilized the core. We've got a few minutes before a full meltdown if we can't fix this." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Options? We need to vent the excess energy before it overloads everything. But doing that while we're surrounded by Imperial ships, it's risky." "They're barely functional," Ethan said, glancing at the Imperial fleet on the holographic display. The enemy ships still drifted aimlessly, their systems fried from the pulse. "If we don't vent the core, this ship won't make it out of here." "Do it." Dr. Niles hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Once we vent, they'll know we're vulnerable. The shields will drop, and the Empire will figure out we're not invincible." Ethan's gaze locked with Niles. "They already know we're not invincible. Now do your job." Without another word, Niles nodded and disappeared down the corridor, heading toward engineering. Ethan turned back to Lieutenant Hayes. "Prepare the crew for emergency venting procedures. I want all non-essential personnel evacuated from the lower decks. If this goes wrong—" She nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Understood, sir." As the crew scrambled to follow orders, Ethan's mind raced. He had spent years preparing for this day, studying the Empire's tactics, and refining the Resolute into a weapon capable of holding its own against the galaxy's most powerful fleet. But now, with the ship on the brink of self-destruction, everything was slipping out of his control. Hayes's voice broke through his thoughts. "Captain, incoming transmission from the Imperial flagship." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Put it through." The image of the Imperial fleet commander flickered to life on the display. His face was a mask of barely contained rage, his sharp features twisted with indignation. "Captain Walker," he hissed, "I don't know what trickery you've used, but this won't last. Your ship can't withstand the full might of the Empire. Surrender now, and I might consider sparing what's left of your planet." Ethan didn't flinch. "I think we've made it clear that Earth isn't as weak as you thought. You've only delayed the inevitable," the commander sneered. "Our reinforcements are already en route. Once they arrive, you won't stand a chance." The words hung in the air, heavier than the threat of the core meltdown. Reinforcements. Ethan had known this wasn't the Empire's full strength, but hearing it confirmed chilled him. They didn't have time for a prolonged engagement, not with the ship's systems on the verge of collapse. He leaned forward, his voice cold and steady. "We'll see about that. End transmission." The hologram blinked out, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Lieutenant Hayes turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Reinforcements, sir?" "They're bluffing," Ethan said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "Right now, we focus on surviving the next few minutes." Before she could respond, the ship lurched again, harder this time. The lights flickered, and a warning message scrolled across the display: "Core unstable. Vent immediately. ****. Ethan's heart raced. "Lieutenant Hayes, are we ready?" "Dr. Niles is in position," she replied. "We can vent on your command." He took a deep breath. This was it. The entire mission could fall apart in the next few seconds. If they failed, the Resolute would go up in flames, and Earth would be left defenseless against the Empire's wrath. But if they succeeded, they would live to fight another day. "Do it," Ethan ordered. Hayes relayed the command, and the entire ship groaned as the venting process began. For a moment, it felt as though the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Then, with a deafening roar, the Resolute released a massive surge of energy into space, the excess power from the pulse cannon venting in a blinding cascade of light. Ethan's hands tightened on the console as he watched the shields flicker and die. The Resolute was exposed, vulnerable for the first time since the battle had begun. If the Imperial fleet regained any of its functionality now, they were finished. Seconds ticked by. Ethan's eyes scanned the display, searching for any sign of movement from the enemy ships. But the Imperial fleet remained silent, drifting through space like the corpses of fallen giants. "Energy levels stabilizing," Hayes reported, relief flooding her voice. "The core is back under control." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Good. Get the shields back online as soon as possible." But before she could respond, a new alert flashed across the screen. Ethan froze. It wasn't coming from the Resolute. "Sir," Hayes said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's another ship. Just outside our sensor range." Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected this. "Imperial reinforcements?" Hayes shook her head, her fingers flying across the controls. "No, sir. It's something else. I don't recognize the configuration." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as the unknown vessel appeared on the holographic display. It was unlike anything they had seen before, sleek, angular, and radiating an ominous energy signature. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't part of the plan. The Resolute was still vulnerable, and now they were facing an unknown threat. "What the hell is that?" Hayes muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. Ethan didn't have an answer. But he knew one thing for certain: whatever this new ship was, it had come for them. Before anyone could react, the ship's comms crackled to life. A deep, unfamiliar voice echoed through the bridge. "You've done well, Captain Walker. But your fight is far from over. Ethan's eyes widened, his mind racing to process what was happening. The new ship's presence was a complication he hadn't foreseen, and the implications were terrifying. Who were they, and what did they want? As the unknown vessel closed in, its energy levels spiking, Ethan realized the next battle was already upon them. "Prepare for impact," he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. The crew scrambled to respond, but deep down, Ethan knew they were woefully unprepared for what was coming next. The Resolute shuddered as the unknown vessel closed the distance, its dark, angular form cutting through space like a blade. Ethan's heart raced, his mind calculating options faster than he could voice them. This ship wasn't Imperial, its design, its energy signature, nothing matched what they had seen before. And yet it felt familiar. Too familiar. "Shields are at 50% and rising," Lieutenant Hayes reported, her voice tight with urgency. "Weapon systems are online, but they're still recharging from the pulse." Ethan barely heard her. His gaze was locked on the holographic display, watching the unknown ship's trajectory. It wasn't firing. Not yet. But it was moving closer, too close. "Who the hell are they?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Behind him, Dr. Niles appeared, his face pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Captain," he began, his voice low, "I ran a scan on that ship. Its energy signature is almost identical to the technology we've been using for the pulse cannon." Ethan snapped his head toward Niles, eyes wide. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that ship might have come from the same place as the technology we reverse-engineered. They know what we're capable of because they built the original." The air in the command room seemed to freeze. Ethan could feel the weight of Niles' words pressing down on him, the realization sinking in fast. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something much bigger than the Empire, bigger than anything they had anticipated. "Sir?" Hayes called out. "Incoming transmission from the unidentified ship." "Should I?" "Patch it through," Ethan ordered, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. The holographic display flickered, and the image of a figure materialized. They were humanoid, but their features were sharp, elongated, their skin a pale silver that shimmered under the soft glow of the ship's lights. Eyes like dark onyx studied Ethan from across the void. "Captain Walker," the being said, its voice deep and resonant, "you've done well to wield our technology against the Empire. But this battle was never yours to fight." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" "We are the architects of the weapon you now call a pulse cannon. Long ago, we abandoned the use of such technology, for we understood the dangers it posed. But you have resurrected it." A chill crept up Ethan's spine. He could hear the condemnation in the being's voice, a quiet, simmering fury beneath the surface. "We didn't have a choice. The Empire forced our hand." The being tilted its head slightly, as though considering his words. "Perhaps. But the consequences of your actions are beyond your comprehension." Ethan's gaze hardened. "If you're here to stop us, you'll have to do better than a lecture." A moment of silence passed. Then the being spoke again, its voice colder. "We are not your enemies, Captain. But if you continue on this path, we will be." Ethan clenched his fists. He didn't have time for cryptic warnings. Earth was still under threat, the Resolute barely holding together after the last engagement. And now, they were dealing with a race whose technology surpassed even the Empire's. The weight of responsibility bore down on him, and yet, there was no turning back. "I don't have time for games," Ethan said, his voice low but fierce. "If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, get out of my way." The being's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if he had pushed too far. But instead of anger, the being's expression softened into something resembling pity. "You don't understand," it said quietly. "The Empire's reinforcements are not what you should fear. The technology you wield is unstable, dangerous. It was never meant to be used this way. If you continue, you will destroy not only your enemies but yourselves." Ethan felt a pang of doubt in his chest, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for fear. We'll handle the consequences. The being studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, Captain. But remember this, the path you walk now will lead to ruin. When the time comes, you will face a choice. And the fate of your world will depend on it. With that, the transmission ended, the figure fading into darkness. The unknown ship hung in the distance for a moment longer, then, without a word, it turned and disappeared into the stars, leaving the Resolute alone once more. The bridge remained silent, the crew processing what had just happened. Lieutenant Hayes was the first to speak. Captain, what do we do? Ethan stared at the empty void where the alien ship had been. His mind raced with possibilities, but there was only one path forward. The Empire's reinforcements were still coming, and Earth needed him. Whatever the alien had warned him about, it would have to wait. We finished the mission, Ethan said, his voice firm. Get the engines back to full capacity. We're moving out. Hayes hesitated. And the pulse cannon? Ethan met her gaze, the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. We keep it ready. Just in case. The bridge crew moved with purpose, the tension lifting slightly as they returned to their stations. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping out of his control. The alien's warning echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt about the path they were on. Suddenly, an alert flashed across the console. Hayes's face went pale as she read the data. Captain, I'm picking up multiple signatures. Imperial reinforcements. They've just entered the system. Ethan's heart pounded. This was it. The real battle had begun. How many? He asked, his voice calm despite the rising dread. Hayes's fingers flew across the controls, pulling up the display. It's worse than we thought. 5 destroyers, 2 carriers, and... She stopped, her eyes widening as she read the final reading. Sir, they brought a dreadnought. Ethan's blood ran cold. A dreadnought. The Empire's largest and most powerful warship, capable of wiping out entire fleets on its own. And they were still limping from the last battle. He turned to face the crew, his jaw set. Prepare for battle. Full power to the shields. We don't let them take Earth. But deep down, as the massive Imperial fleet loomed closer on the display, he couldn't shake the fear that the alien's warning might have been right after all. The bridge was silent, save for the low hum of the ship's systems and the occasional beeping of consoles. The dreadnought loomed on the horizon, its silhouette massive and imposing, blocking out the distant stars. Ethan could feel the weight of every crew member's gaze on him, waiting for orders, waiting for a miracle. How long until they're in range? Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Lieutenant Hayes glanced at her console, her face pale but composed. 10 minutes, maybe less. They're closing fast. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. A dreadnought. He had fought battles against overwhelming odds before, but nothing like this. The Empire had deployed its ultimate weapon, and the Resolute was already battered from the last engagement. The shields were up, the engines back online, but they were far from at full strength. One wrong move, and it was all over. We need options, Ethan said, his voice steady. What are we looking at? Dr. Niles stepped forward, wiping the sweat from his brow. The dreadnought is equipped with long-range plasma cannons and a full complement of fighters. Their shields are almost impenetrable by conventional means, and their firepower could wipe us out in one shot if we're not careful. Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected as much. What about the pulse cannon? Niles hesitated. It's risky. We managed to stabilize the core after the last blast, but I don't know if the system can handle another pulse so soon. The feedback could cripple us. Ethan's jaw tightened. The pulse cannon was their only real weapon against a ship of this size. But using it again could mean the end of the Resolute. Still, without it, they didn't stand a chance. We don't have a choice, Ethan said, his voice firm. Prepare the pulse cannon. We'll need to time it perfectly. Hayes's gaze flickered with concern. And what about the rest of the fleet? The destroyers and carriers? They'll close the gap before the dreadnought, Ethan replied. We focus on disabling the dreadnought. If we can take out their flagship, the rest might retreat. He didn't believe it, not really. The Empire wasn't known for retreating, especially not when they had brought a dreadnought to the fight. But it was the best plan they had, and it was better than admitting the truth, that they were outmatched, outgunned, and running out of time. We'll need a distraction, Ethan continued. Lieutenant Hayes deployed the drone swarm. Program them to mimic our energy signature. That should confuse their targeting systems long enough for us to get into position. Hayes nodded, turning to her console. Understood. As she worked, Ethan allowed himself a moment to breathe. His hands rested on the edge of the command console, his knuckles white from the pressure. He had known this day would come, the day when Earth would be forced to stand alone against the Empire. But he hadn't expected it to feel like this. The weight of every decision pressed down on him, every choice a potential death sentence for his crew, for his world. We can do this, he muttered under his breath. We've made it this far. But even as the words left his mouth, doubt gnawed at him. The alien's warning echoed in his mind, the memory of that cold, calculating voice saying, *, the path you walk now will lead to ruin. Ethan had dismissed it then, but now, as the dreadnought drew closer, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Pulse cannon charged, Captain, Niles said, breaking Ethan's reverie. We're ready. Ethan straightened, pushing the doubt aside. There was no room for second-guessing now. Hayes, are the drones in position? They're moving into formation now, she replied. They should be able to mask our approach for a few minutes, maybe more if we're lucky. Ethan nodded. That's all we need. Helm, bring us in closer. I want us within pulse range as soon as their shields drop. The Resolute surged forward, cutting through space toward the heart of the Imperial fleet. The dreadnought was a dark, looming presence ahead, its cannons glowing faintly with the promise of destruction. Around it, the destroyers and carriers moved like wolves in a pack, circling, waiting for the moment to strike. Drone swarm deployed, Hayes reported. Their targeting systems are confused. We're holding position behind the drones, but they won't stay fooled for long. Ethan's eyes never left the dreadnought. How long until we're in range? 2 minutes, Niles said. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. They were so close. The dreadnought loomed larger and larger on the screen, a dark shadow blocking out everything else. The tension in the bridge was palpable, every breath measured, every movement deliberate. They were moments away from either victory or destruction. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring across the bridge. Ethan grabbed the console to steady himself. What the hell was that? Sir? Hayes called out, panic creeping into her voice. One of the destroyers, it's broken through the drone swarm. They've got a lock on us. Evasive maneuvers! Ethan shouted, but it was too late. Another blast rocked the ship, and the lights flickered as the shields took the hit. The Resolute veered sharply, but the destroyer was relentless, its cannons lighting up the space around them. Shields are down to 30%, Hayes reported. We can't take another hit like that. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose the pulse cannon now, not when they were so close. Niles, divert all power to the pulse. We need to take that dreadnought out, now. Niles's hands flew over the controls, his face tense. I'm on it, Captain. Ethan turned back to the screen, watching as the dreadnought prepared to fire its main cannon. The glow of the weapon built, an ominous pulse of energy that would spell their doom if they didn't act fast. We're in range! Niles shouted. Ethan didn't hesitate. Fire! The pulse cannon unleashed its blast, a blinding surge of energy that shot toward the dreadnought, cutting through space like a blade. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in suspended animation, the pulse hurtling toward its target, the dreadnought's weapon charging, the destroyers circling like vultures. And then, just as the pulse hit the dreadnought's shields, something went wrong. The ship lurched violently, the power flickering, the consoles sparking with electricity. Captain? Niles shouted. The core, it's overloading. Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach. Shut it down! I can't! Niles's hands were a blur over the controls. It's too late! Before Ethan could respond, the ship rocked again, harder this time, as if the very fabric of space was tearing around them. And then, with a deafening roar, the pulse cannon exploded. The bridge went dark.